We went through all of these choices, Stephen Miller for Attorney General, Kash Patel, CIA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the sort of conceits in this article by Axios is that any of these people would have to go through some sort of process in the United States Senate to be confirmed. I think that that is quite a conceit to have. If Donald Trump is reelected, that sort of process won't matter anymore. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, he could make them acting secretaries of state or acting cabinet ministers. He might just skip the process altogether. And I should say, you know, it's very common in other failing or democracies in trouble for the second term of the would-be autocratic party to be much different and much worse than the first. I mean, that's what happened in Viktor Orban's Hungary. It was after he lost an election and came back that he really created a one-party state, much in this way, appointing loyalists. It's really the second try after the experience of briefly being in office or the experience of failure that they're much more likely to try again. So I think it's an accurate analysis that it's something that we should worry about.
Well, I think about Maduro, right, who's been there, what now, 13 years or however many years. They get worse as they go on because they learn from their previous experience, right? Netanyahu was one way the first time that he ran. He's now like, I think I'll just take over the Supreme Court and change it because I have a criminal indictment. You can go on and on. Poland had this. They only recently emerged from it. Italy has faced it. It's kind of everywhere. What do you make of the fact that Donald Trump, he fits into that same milieu of people who they had some experience now. They now know what they, quote unquote, did wrong. And now the idea is to stack the deck with people who are only loyal to him. And therefore, there is no process. There is no sort of bureaucracy that slows him down. That's the idea.
No, I mean, that's the definition of how you create a one-party state is, you know, what's the qualification for a government job? You know, is it that you understand water pollution and you know how to fix it?
Right.
Or are you somebody's cousin, you know, or are you somebody's friend? And in states that are declining, where democracy is failing, and sometimes actually where the bureaucracy is failing and the economy is failing, this is the kind of political system that you have.
Right. And Denver, you know, you've been part of investigating all that happened on January 6th. I mean, the idea is that what Donald Trump seems to have learned from the experience of January 6th and not being able to complete the coup is that he had the wrong people. Is that the problem was that Mark Milley was not willing to deploy the military, so he'll just get someone who is. The problem wasn't the coup. And it seems to me that Republicans, people in, I'm not even sure if you're a Republican anymore, what they've learned from it is that they need to join in more enthusiastically. Because I have to be honest, I can't think of a single soul in the United States Senate that would stand in his way if he decided that he is now an autocrat and that, for instance, we're not going to have the mechanisms where we have another election, Maduro style. I'm not sure who stops him because I don't know who's left in the party who thinks that's a bad idea.
Yeah, I don't either, because winning is their number one objective, right, Joy? I mean, that's what they want to do. So looking at polling and crosstabs and fundraising, you're saying that Trump is the guy, right, who's going to get them reelected. What's crazy about what you just showed with Kash Patel, with Stephen Miller. And by the way, Joy, I think you just gave a bad name to poo-poo platter, right? I love those. I think the issue that we have right now is what is Kash Patel's main qualification? I mean, really, is that he liked to pose in full leather. I mean, that's pretty much what Kash Patel's qualification is. He likes to take pictures wearing leather. And I think when you have people like that, you value loyalty over competence. You have a problem with our government. Now, loyalty, of course, is always something in you know, presidential appointments and things like that. It comes into play. But you really have nepotism of idiots. And I think that's the thing that bothers me, is that these people just aren't qualified. They're specifically attuned to Trump's needs and wants. A lot of that is authoritarianism bent. The other thing, too, when you're looking at their comments, it should scare the hell out of people that they are absolutely, just like January 6th, they're telegraphing their punch. We knew it was coming on January. We saw the open source intelligence. You know, I was warning about it on the floor of Congress starting, what, in August, Joy? So they're telegraphing their punch. Believe them what they say. Believe people in what they say to you, because it's exactly what they're going to do. And I think that's why we need to fight. And if they want to come after people, and I love what Ann said also, if they want to come after individuals like us, or they want to try to make a loyalty component the first thing that they're trying to do, it is our job to rise up and fight back. And by the way, there's a lot of other intelligence analysts and counterterrorism analysts and former military people out here who are happy to fight for the United States Constitution.
Well, see, that becomes the question. And I'll pose it to you, because then what happens is that we then have to count on whatever institutions are left to not be full of people who are sympathetic. We do know that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers draw from the military, they draw from police. So then we have to say, well, what percentage of current military are willing to stop it? who stands against it. It's not clear how widespread the authoritarianism is in each of these institutions. And so we'd have to just trust that somebody stands up to it. When you look at our system, the sort of openness of our system, do you see guardrails left? I fail to see very many when I just look at it. And I think that in general, the military is still strong and loyal to the Constitution. But there are some in it who are oath keepers.
Yeah, I think, the experience of the last administration, I think the leadership of the military is clearly still loyal to the Constitution. Absolutely. And the leadership of most institutions, the other security services and so on are as well. The problem is that it often takes only a minority of people.
Right.
I would say the majority of Americans don't believe in authoritarianism, don't want autocracy, believe in the Constitution, and certainly the vast majority of people who work for the federal government in whatever capacity. The problem is that it can often take very few people. It's just a few people making the wrong decisions at the wrong moment in a few places, and who are really determined to make the change. And others are usually not prepared and not organized. And once someone has broken the Constitution, and I actually lived through this in Poland, I watched it happen. Mm-hmm. Once that's happened and taken place, then there isn't really even a legal way to push back, because the rule of law has already been undermined, and then people are a little bit at sea as to how to behave.
As to how to behave, and the other problem is human adaptability. I've been to Cuba, and what you see is a lot of people who have adapted to autocracy rather than actively fight it, because after all, who am I, how do I fight it when it's the system, and the system is overwhelming, and a lot of people simply adapt to it, which is what scares me. There's also, Denver, the idea of auditioning. Far be it from me to play the foolishness that aired on, what is it called, News Nation the other night, this supposed debate for second place, or for, to be Donald Trump's leader of his fan club. Let me just play one person, Vivek Ramaswamy, because this other thing that's happening is you're seeing people audition to be a part of the team. Here is his audition in which he completely lies about January 6th. Here he is.
Why am I the only person on the stage, at least, who can say that January 6th now does look like it was an inside job? That the government lied to us for 20 years about Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11? That the Great Replacement theory is not some grand right-wing conspiracy theory?
There was that. At one point, Ashley Babbitt's mother had to correct him, or I'm sorry, not him. Sorry, I will not. Let me take that back. There was another part in which Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley tried to sort of outbigot each other and sort of each be harder on the LGBTQ community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You had a gentleman who was sentenced for January 6th activity, who claimed at his sentencing hearing that the whole thing was a conspiracy, that the CIA was behind it, and then said Ashley Babbitt wasn't even dead. And her mother in the hallway had to correct him and say, she's dead, right? So there is sort of an auditioning. What do you make of that? That is what we're seeing here, is that people are all auditioning to join Donald Trump's team.
Joy, watching this, I saw the data for January 6th, and I've looked at conspiracy theories for a long time, and myths and those type of beliefs. I've looked at radicalization, the war on terror. Vivek Ramaswamy, what he's saying is actually dangerous. I don't think he believes any of it. I don't think he has any moral compass. But false flags, they're the bastion of the most ignorant conspiracy theorists. And Vivek, if he believes it or doesn't, it doesn't really matter, because what he's doing is going back to that radicalization cycle for people that are listening to it. And if the audition from Vivek is that he comes out and says these type of things, so he gets on Trump's good side, this should chill the American public. Because when you talk about January 6th, it wasn't an inside job. It's proven. It's ridiculous to say that. He always likes to step into 9/11 trutherism. And when you're talking about Great Replacement, you're talking about one of the most racist theories out there. And it really is ironic, looking where Vivek Ramaswamy comes from, looking at his skin color too, the fact that he would be mentioning the Great Replacement theory means he's the smarmiest, one of the worst individuals that I've ever seen on the political stage, maybe besides Donald Trump. And I don't say that lightly. Vivek Ramaswamy is dangerous because he minds the ignorant and he minds the stupid. And that's what he does. And he's very effective at it because he's very good at translating ignorance to the masses. And it's something he's good at.